All right, guys, I'm going to walk you through these notes that are titled FDR2. It just gives you a little bit more um, understanding of how the New Deal ended and what it did and didn't do. Okay, so first thing is we need to talk about the effects of the New Deal, and there are some major effects. So the first major effect is that the labor unions are going to grow a lot. This is because of the Wagner Act, which was part of the Second New Deal, which made it to where basically anyone could join the labor unions. Now, the biggest benefactor of that is actually going to be United States auto workers. Auto unions are going to become huge. The United Auto Workers, or the UAW, is going to become the biggest union in America. And actually, this is part of the reason for why we don't have a lot of factory jobs today. Basically, the unions became so powerful and they became so efficient at actually providing lots of labor rights for their workers that it caused for a lot of the shops to just close and for manufacturers to move their factories overseas to get away from the labor unions. So the second thing is that women are going to get some gains, but that's mainly due to Eleanor Roosevelt, who I'll talk about in just a second. And then the third major thing is that black people are going to begin to transition from the Republican Party to the Democrat Party. That was something that took place even though a lot of black people did not get several things from the New Deal. For example, they did not get to have a federal lynching law that they were trying to get. They wanted to make lynching a hate crime, essentially, so that the FBI would investigate it. Because if local authorities investigated lynchings during this time, like nothing usually came off of it, because sometimes the local authorities were the ones doing the lynching. So you wanted to bring in some outsider to do the investigating. That did not happen. And also, there were certain job programs that discriminated against black people. So even though the Democrat Party wasn't really like riding hard for black people during this time, because the Democrat Party was seen as the party for trying to create more jobs for lower income Americans, black people are going to become more attracted to that than the Republican Party, which the Republican Party is now the party of Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, who all still believed in laissez-faire economics. And how lower income people took that was basically as a very cold message for when people were suffering at the start of the Great Depression. So then you'll answer this question on the Nearpod. All right, now how the New Deal is ultimately going to end is it's going to roll into kind of World War II. Now, the court packing plan did hurt FDR's popularity, and so did a mini recession that took place in 1938. Um, FDR had tried to get rid of some of the New Deal programs, basically to see if the economy could walk on its own, and it couldn't. That basically showed that what the New Deal was doing was providing some temporary relief, but it wasn't actually fixing the economical problems that had started with the Great Depression. Um, so because of that, the Depression continued on into 1940. So if you're wondering, well, if these two things really started to hurt FDR's popularity, how the heck was he reelected for a third time in 1940? A lot of that has to do with World War II. World War II was really gearing up in Europe, and while America was not necessarily involved yet, the United States really felt like the continuity of having FDR continue to be president to preside over this war, even if the United States wasn't involved, was a good idea. Um, so it's going to take World War II, though, to end the Great Depression. It did ease some suffering, and it did make the president a lot more powerful. Okay, now FDR and the civil rights movement is a very, very complicated issue. And the reason for why is because FDR had polio. What that meant was he could not use his legs, and he did not want people to see him in a wheelchair. So what that meant was his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, would go and give a lot of his public speeches. Now, they had a very, very complicated marriage. Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR actually both had affairs, long-lasting affairs. Eleanor Roosevelt was with FDR's major bodyguard for a while. Some people think she might have had a same-sex relationship as well with a reporter named Hick, although we're not 100% sure. They wrote thousands of letters back and forth to each other, but somebody has taken those letters and destroyed them, so we're not exactly sure what was in them. Um, and then FDR had a long-lasting relationship with a lady named Missy. And in fact, when FDR died, Eleanor Roosevelt was not even in the room. It was the mistress that was in the room, and she called Eleanor Roosevelt. But they stayed married to one another mainly because at this point, the president could not get divorced. It would have been a big scandal. And so Eleanor used that as a way to promote her platform. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very much as a part of the civil rights movement. She really wanted for the civil rights movement to take place. Because she spoke for FDR, sometimes she spoke against his wishes. For example, she really wanted the lynching law to become a federal crime. And it's believed now that maybe FDR was either indifferent or didn't really care, or was indifferent, or maybe was even kind of opposed to it. But it's tough to tell because she was his mouthpiece. All that to say, FDR is given some credit for the civil rights at the time, and a lot of that's been removed from him now and given to Eleanor Roosevelt. And we see FDR more as an indifferent president. I guess the way you could think about this is FDR was born into a very, very privileged white Northern family. His interactions with black people were pretty limited his entire life. And so therefore, it was not on the top of his agenda. He did, though, recognize that he should not try to solve things for the black community themselves. And so he organized what was called the Black Cabinet to kind of do that. He didn't always listen to them, but it was one of the first times that a president was trying to seek out black voices. Now, there was a massive protest arranged against FDR and his administration, led by a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who's right here. A. Philip Randolph was going to organize the March on Washington. It was going to be so big, and it was going to demonstrate against the discrimination that black people were facing in certain jobs. So this was going to be called the Fair Employment Act, that they wanted to make sure that there were no job discriminations, at least against defense industry. Now, the defense industry is anyone who makes something for the military. So this march was going to be so big that FDR caved in to the demands of A. Philip Randolph before the march even happened, and because of that, Philip canceled the march. Um, and so the Fair Employment Act was created, and it banned racial discrimination in hiring defense industry workers. This was a massive gain for black people during World War II, which we'll talk more about when we get to World War II. So go ahead and answer that question. And then your final thing you have is Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt was a very politically active woman. She's going to continue this evolution of women and what women could and couldn't do. Before Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady was basically a servant in the house. She would bring tea and drinks out to the company of her husband. Eleanor Roosevelt is going to establish her own agenda. And her agenda was mainly about civil rights. So FDR, again, he was quiet, but Eleanor was not. And she urged FDR to hire women and black people, and he did. Mary Bethune was one of the first examples of a White House administrator who was black and a woman. Now, the reason why FDR did this, and again, this is where it's complicated, even though these guys had like a very, very, we'll say, loveless marriage, there was still some mutual respect between the two of them. FDR did respect Eleanor Roosevelt's opinions a lot. And so because of that, she could persuade him to do things. Just another wrinkle into all of that. All right, last thing is just a couple random notes about the New Deal that I didn't include yesterday. First is you need to know about the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is one of the first New Deal programs that was created, and it was created as a job program, so it was designed to give jobs to people, to build dams in the South. These dams would bring electricity to rural parts of America. The second is just one difference between the second New Deal and the first New Deal. The second New Deal is more long-range reform, so something that's supposed to go on forever. The first New Deal, more short-term. And then the first New Deal was set up into three R's: relief, recovery, reform. So relief was all about helping making sure the economy didn't get worse. So that was like him closing the banks. Recovery is creating temporary programs to help people. This is the pump priming programs The Tennessee Valley Authority would actually be an example of that. It was supposed to be temporary. You give people jobs, jobs get money. And then the third was reform, which is create laws to make sure that this doesn't happen again. This would be like the FDIC, which creates the insurance on banks. All right. And then finally, I just posted this little chart right here. It has the unemployment rates along with like some major acts that took place. One of the things that you'll kind of notice, one, you'll see this depression in 1938 where the unemployment went from 14 to 19%. So that's kind of what I was talking about there. And then the second thing is you'll see that from 1933, the unemployment was 25%, which is insanely high. I think right now it's around like 7% in America, just so you can kind of understand what that means. And it does drop in 1940 to 14%, but that's because all of these programs were still in play. And then, but it's really World War II that drops us all the way back down to 1.9%, which is the lowest it's ever been. All right, and that is your notes for today.